Presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States. He served 2 terms in office from 1913 to 1921. Wilson was a progressive Democrat who believed in the power of the federal government to expose corruption, regulate the economy, eliminate unethical business practices, and improve the general condition of society. During Wilson's years in office, the U.S. federal government was segregated, and the Ku Klux Klan experienced a major revival. Wilson's second term in office was dominated by the First World War. Though Wilson campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," escalating German aggression ultimately made it impossible for the United States to stay out of the conflict. Woodrow Wilson's rise to power. Woodrow Wilson was born in Staunton, Virginia in 1856 to a very religious family. His father was one of the founders of the Southern Presbyterian Church, and Wilson's religious upbringing shaped his political views and the outlook on the world. He grew up in Georgia and South Carolina and was the first Southerner to become president since James Polk in 1848. Wilson ran on the Democratic ticket in 1912 presidential election and triumphed. Wilson campaigned on a new freedom platform, which promised banking, taxes, and business change, while pledging to respect individual freedoms and private industry. Woodrow Wilson's first term in office. Once in office, Wilson pursued this agenda. He lowered taxes. He created the Federal Reserve System, something that we're actually using today. It's a reserve of things that we would need in an emergency. He was championing antitrust legislation. He improved protection for workers and established the Federal Trade Commission to crack down on monopolistic business practices. These policies reflected Wilson's faith in the progressive movement, which sought to harness the power of the federal government to regulate the economy, expose corruption, and improve society, and the negative effects of industrialization. So as you remember, you guys last read about the muckrakers and the progressive movement. The muckrakers were people who were like news reporters of today. They would go and seek out the truth and kind of air out any corruption that was going on in America at the time. So what Woodrow Wilson wanted to do is he wanted to stay on the same lines as that. He wanted the government to have more of an involvement in making sure that businesses had safe practices for all their workers and that there was no corruption going on. On the civil rights fronts, Wilson administration pursued regressive policies working with Southern Democrats to segregate the federal government. After years of African American advances in the civil service, this represented a huge step backwards for the civil rights. During these years, the Ku Klux Klan experienced a major revival. President Wilson aligned himself symbolically with the KKK by ordering a private screening of D.W. Griffith's notoriously racist film, Birth of a Nation, which portrayed African Americans as savage criminals, and the KKK as heroic enforcers of a just and humane racial order. The National Association for Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, numerous religious groups, both black and white, set forward to condemn Wilson's segregationist racial agenda. So in Wilson's first term, he came out as supporting the Ku Klux Klan, which was a group of people who were into segregation. They thought they were the most important race, the most important people, and kind of wanted to go through with making that perfect race. So he did support that, and people ended up stepping forward and hating that he did that. Woodrow Wilson's second term and First World War. Wilson ran opposed to the Democratic primaries for the 1916 presidential election on a platform emphasizing progressive goals such as protection for female workers, the elimination of child labor, and the establishment of minimum wage. So those are all things coming out of the Industrial Revolution that he really wanted to focus on. More rights for females in the workplace, putting a stop to child labor, and kind of putting those guidelines and that cap on how old you can be if you're going to be working, and also establishing minimum wage. And this would fend off corruption by making companies pay a certain amount to their workers. The campaign was conducted amidst the war in Europe and the Mexican Revolution, and Wilson ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." This would prove to be ironic indeed, as in his second term in office, the United States entered World War I. Wilson triumphed over his Republican rival in 1916 presidential election by a slender margin. So he just won. There wasn't a huge gap between him and his other contender running for presidency. There was barely any, he didn't win by a landslide. Wilson's second term in office was dominated by the First World War. Wilson embraced a policy of neutrality in the European conflict, behaving that war resulted from the corrupt nature of the European power politics. But German aggression ultimately made it impossible for the United States to remain on the sidelines. So at this point, America's just observing the conflict between all the different countries in Europe, and Germany ended up getting a little bit aggressive to the point where the United States could not just sit back and watch the Germans move forward with their plan. In May 1915, the Germans sunk the British ocean liner the Lusitania, which had many Americans on board. Early in 1917, the Germans adopted a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, a decision that was almost immediately followed by the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram. The telegram pledged German support for Mexican recovery of the territories of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona from the United States. The United States declared war on Germany in April 1917. So what was happening is Germany told Mexico that they were going to support them and having Mexico reclaim New Mexico, Texas, Arizona. And the United States is like, no one's going to go help anybody come claim our land. So they decided to declare war on them. In January 1918, Wilson issued his famous 14 points, which laid out the long-term objectives of U.S. involvement in war. Wilson envisioned a post-war world in which all nations enjoyed mutual cooperation and respect, and belonged to a league of nations who would peacefully resolve all international disputes. Due to the opposition of isolationists in Congress, the United States never joined the League of Nations. Wilson died in 1924 with his dreams for the post-war world unrealized. However, many of Wilson's ideas and principles would be embodied in the Charter of the United Nations, which was founded after the Second World War. So what do you think? I want you to complete your questions either through Khan Academy, or you can complete the questions on the modified sheet I have created. I am looking forward to seeing your answers.